great turnout for a very important discussion we're going to have today. And I highlight the word discussion because that's really what we want it to be. We've sent to many of your colleges and universities a list of questions that we will be talking about in a few moments after we had a chance to hear from Congressman Brooks. I want to make just a few comments to begin with. First, thank you for being here. I know you're all busy people. As best I can tell, we have 21 colleges and universities from Indiana represented today. So that's a great commitment to this very important discussion on campus sexual assault. I want to point a couple people out to begin with. First, I'd like to comment on Representative Christina Hale, who's here with us today. And it's really safe to say that much of the reason we're together is because of her. She came to the commission several months ago and highlighted her commitment to working on this issue as a continuing commitment that she's made to issues relating to sexual violence against women in particular, but campus safety issues in a broader sense as well. So thank you. She had another conflict today. She was supposed to be out of town, but she made a commitment to be with us, so we appreciate that very much. And then, in case I forget, I'd like to call out Sam Snyman from the Commission and Megan Savage from Congressman Brooks' office, and thank you for the work that you've done to put together today's program. So with that, just a couple comments about why we are gathering and what we'd like to see accomplished from today's meeting. It's those of you, and most of you in the room, are involved in higher education. We did invite some representatives of the criminal justice system, and we will continue our discussions with them as we continue this very important discussion about sexual assault on campuses and safety in a broader term. But those of you who are involved in higher education know that it's pretty hard to read the Chronicle, any week, or any other publication inside higher education or anything else and not have a discussion or a story or an article about sexual assault. It's become a very important issue at the federal level and at the state level, and certainly has always been an important issue at the institutional level as well. So we started talking about this several months ago to figure out if there was something that we needed to be doing that we weren't doing in Indiana at the level that we needed to ensure safety on campus. And we've had a couple meetings. I've had subsequent meetings with the leadership of many of your colleges and universities to indicate to the commission and then for us to share that information with the Congresswoman about what's happening on our college campuses. There are several pieces of legislation that are working their way through, and she will be talking about one in particular. But regardless of how much we think we're doing, it's clear that people would like us to look at this issue again and figure out if we're doing everything that we need to. Those of you who are familiar with Reaching Higher Achieving More, which is our strategic plan for higher education at the Commission, will know that we have three sections. We talk about college completion, we talk about productivity, and we talk about academic quality. Our current chair of the Commission is Dennis Bland, who runs the Center for Leadership Development here in Indianapolis, and he has asked us this year to extend the discussion about quality to more than just academic quality, as important as that is, but to talk about quality of life as well, and what that means to the students on our campuses. I see that Susana Duarte Suarez, a member of our commission, is with us, and I'm not sure if there are any other commission members here or not at this point, but we may be joined a little bit later. So we know that campus safety is a critical and just sort of a prerequisite to doing well in school, and that is you have to feel like you're safe in school as well. We also are committed to looking at this issue at our November commission meeting. We have what we call a public square discussion every month, and this will be the topic of our discussion in November. So interest from the state and federal policymakers is higher than ever. And we'd like to take this opportunity today to talk about this, I think really to accomplish two things. One, at the end of the day, we won't finish, but to have a more complete discussion about what gaps might exist if they're there and what we're doing well and what we'd like to be committed to doing even better. To use this as an opportunity to share with our Congresswoman, who is a sponsor of legislation working its way through right now, what you think might be important for her to consider as she has a seat at the table talking about these important issues. So we will try to explain as clearly as we can what some of the federal legislation looks like today. I know those of you who work in this area are probably much more familiar than we are at the commission, but we saw this as an opportunity to hear from you as well. So we'll hear from you about the policies that you have in place, what you think conflicting policies might be that would be helpful. As you know, we have really 3 pieces of legislation. That we have Title IX, we have the Clery Act, and we have the Violence Against Women Act, all 3 very important federal pieces of legislation. At this point, there's no specific state policy or law that deals with this issue. As keeping with the way we run higher education in the state of Indiana, we give much authority to the Board of Trustees and the leadership of the colleges and universities to determine best policies. But this would be our chance to see if there's something that we can do to help you in that. So with that as just a little bit of a context for today's discussion, I'd like to introduce our guest with us today, who's certainly well known to all of us. I mentioned that she had been at Ivy Tech, but she's done lots of other things as well. I can't think of anybody whose experience makes her better suited to talk about this discussion today than Congresswoman Brooks. Clearly, she comes from a strong legal background. She's been involved in education, and now she's obviously representing the 5th Congressional District of Indiana in Washington, D.C. Good news for us, she serves on the Education and Workforce Committee, the Homeland Security and Ethics Committees. She also chairs the Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications. How many times do you have to say that? I'm sure there's no good acronym. There is an acronym?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think I can remember the acronym either. But, and just this year, she was also named to the Select Committee on events surrounding the 2012 terrorist attack in Benghazi. So as I mentioned, she has a very diverse background. She served as Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Ivy Tech Community College. In 2001, she was appointed by President George Bush as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, and we all know many of her efforts there that had to do with issues ranging from gun violence, drug trafficking, gangs, child exploitation, and many other issues as well. So we were grateful for her service there. Some of you may recall, it wasn't that long ago, that she actually also was Deputy Mayor of Indianapolis during the time that Steve Goldsmith was mayor. She practiced law. She comes to us with so many credentials that make her ideally suited for today's discussion and to represent us in Congress. With that, I'd like to introduce Congresswoman Susan Brooks.
Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be here. Thank you, Lisa, for that incredibly kind introduction. I'd also like to thank the Indiana Commission on Higher Education for putting together, proposing this important conference today, and what is, I hope, will be a very important listening session for me, for Teresa, for Christina Hale, for Susana Suarez, who's on the commission. We really need to hear from you. I convene a lot of listening sessions on different subjects around my district, which is northern Indianapolis up to Marion, and I really do always come away from those listening sessions learning something that can then be, most helpful to me as we're crafting legislation. I do know that the topic of campus sexual assault ignites a lot of passion. It ignites a lot of opinions from both victims groups and from the higher education community. And I do, interestingly, as Teresa has indicated, I've been involved in the criminal justice system for many years prior to coming and working with Jim Clark here at Ivy Tech and the other Ivy Tech folks here. I actually was a criminal defense attorney for 13 years, and so I represented individuals accused of crimes. I then also worked with law enforcement in the city of Indianapolis and then became U.S. attorney focused on federal prosecution, so I've been on both sides, prosecution and criminal defense. And then I'll tell you though, there's probably no job more complex I learned than higher education. And so, because it is so complex, I do have to tell you before when I was approached about pursuing the position at Ivy Tech, I gave Dottie Frackwell Akal, who I got to know, and when I talked with her about higher education law and all of the complexities that involve, she did share with me then, and I'll never forget the conversation, when she said, well, at Ivy Tech, your job, while it will be complex and it's a huge organization, you don't have dorms, you don't have sororities and fraternities, and you don't have sports teams, okay? And those complexities and those groups of students in dorms, or, and our campuses are typically smaller than your large campuses, it adds a different complexity for all of you. Not that our community college campuses, obviously public safety and safety is so critical, but I know that it is different when you become the home away from home for students, and that all of the communities you all are serving so hard to protect. There are a lot of dynamics, and your students are often younger than those that we dealt with at Ivy Tech, and that has a whole nother level of complexity when you have 18-year-olds coming on to your campus with newfound freedom and newfound responsibilities and taking care of themselves and their friends. Now, the national discussion on campus-based sexual assault really began, I would say, and would like to commend the White House, for putting together a task force to protect students from sexual assault. And so a lot of attention has come because of the national dialogue that's happened. And obviously, you all are aware that in April of 2014, the task force released the report, Not Alone, and then a media campaign has followed, and so forth. And I do have to tell you, I've been on a couple of college campuses in the last couple of weeks since I've been home. I was at my alma mater, Miami University over at Oxford, Ohio, where I spent a good part of the day, met with student leaders. I actually spoke at a Homeland Security conference last week at Purdue called the Vaccine Conference, and asked to speak with student government leaders there, which I did. And one thing that they all shared with me, both at Miami and at Purdue just last week, which I thought was very interesting, is they did admit, because I raised the subject, trust me, they didn't bring it up, okay? I raised the subject to these students, talk to me about what you would like to see your schools do with respect to sexual assault, and they did acknowledge that it needed to come, and one student said, it needs to come from the ground up, not from the top down, which I thought was very interesting. And I said, well then you students have to change the culture. You are the ones that I think, because sexual assault's not a new topic, it was happening when I was in college. It's just happening, I'm afraid, at an increased level now, in all likelihood, or maybe we're talking about it more now, or maybe because kids now are communicating through texting and Instagram and have whole new ways of communicating, maybe it's just more known now as to what's happening. But these are all dynamics that we have to take into account. And so I want to applaud Senator Castle, a Democrat from Missouri, who's been kind of leading the effort. She's a former elected prosecutor, has been focused much of her professional life on sex crimes and domestic violence prevention, and she is the one that really decided to take on the survey to colleges and universities about sexual assault. I am curious to know how many of your colleges received the survey and filled it out and sent it back. I just was curious, and so which colleges? I'm just curious which. IU, who else? Ball State. Okay. St. Mary's. Anybody else? Trying. Okay. Purdue. Okay. Excellent. Yes. Okay. Okay. Terrific. So some of you might be here. Oh yes. Okay. Some of you may be here that either, I'm not certain how it was administered, but want to thank you for returning that, because that is really in part of the foundation of what her legislation is. I joined onto this bill. It is not a perfect bill, but I wanted to make sure that the higher education community had a strong voice in the crafting of this bill. I want to ensure that higher education is not villainized in the discussion about how this is handled. But I also have worked with victims And I've worked with those who've been accused, okay? Some accused wrongfully and some accused proper, in a true way. And so I don't believe the bill is perfect, but I do believe it is an important step forward in helping those students, those young people, and not just young people, this isn't a young person's issue, helping everyone understand that we have to change our culture. We have to change our culture, and it can really not just start at the college age, because college students go back and talk to our high school students. And we know that dating violence and other things starts in high school, actually. It doesn't just start when they arrive on college campuses, it happens at even younger ages. So while I understand the bill isn't perfect, I do view today as a learning and a listening exercise. We wanted to go beyond today. Megan Savage, my legislative director, actually at Hoosier, is out in Washington, D.C. I ask that you continue to funnel your thoughts to Megan as we work hard to craft legislation. I don't know, I can go through the bill. I'm going to just not go into great detail about it, but I'm just going to talk to you very briefly about what it entails. Number one, the bill establishes new campus resources and support services for student survivors. So that is the part of the bill that is focused on confidential advisors and creating a specific designation as a confidential advisor. And we can either, I don't want to go into great detail on all of this because I'm assuming that most of you have read this, understand it, and if not, we can have a Q&A later on. I don't want to go in fact, as Teresa said, many of you probably know this even better than we do. But it is obviously to encourage individuals to come forward and to try to make sure that services are coordinated maybe at a higher degree than they currently are and ensure that there are accommodations for survivors and so forth. I understand this is already, and I'm interested in hearing, I understand this is already part of the Indiana Lifeline law, so I'd be interested in knowing if you agree with that. Number two, it ensures minimum training standards for on-campus personnel. So it ensures that everyone from confidential advisors to those responsible for investigating and participating in disciplinary proceedings will receive specialized training. Number three, it creates, and I really want to hear from you on this, and we have heard from some of you on this already, creates new historic transparency requirements. For the first time, students at every university in America will be surveyed about their experience with sexual violence to get an accurate picture of this problem. It will be standardized and anonymous. DOE will be required to publish the names of the schools with pending investigations, final resolutions, and voluntary resolution agreements. And one of the things that I certainly know, which is, I know it's difficult to do surveys, so this is something that I'm very interested in hearing from you all about this. While I think it's noble, I question how it will be implemented. Number three, increases campus accountability and coordination with law enforcement. Want to thank Officer from IU Police Department who came, but I know that this requires schools to use one uniform process for campus disciplinary proceedings, and they no longer allow athletic departments or other subgroups to handle their own investigations. And it will require colleges and universities to enter into an MOU with local law enforcement, which that I appreciate. It just put the onus on universities rather than requiring under this bill, rather than requiring local law enforcement to also enter into the MOU, and we need to talk about that as well. And then it finally establishes enforceable Title IX penalties and stiffer penalties for Clery Act violations, and want to talk about that. One of my concerns with that, with respect to compliance, is that the DOE that would be involved in the investigations of any potential violations or of compliance actually is rewarded in the finding that your universities and colleges would receive. DOE actually is rewarded by allowing to keep some of those fines, which I question whether or not that makes much sense. But again, this is all open for discussion. Finally, I just want to tell you where it stands, and while it has been, there are 22 bipartisan members of the House that have signed on to this bill, And Carolyn Maloney of New York is leading it in the House. Clarence McCaskill is leading it in the Senate. It is not expected to move in this 113th Congress for a final vote. It's unclear whether or not we'll have hearings in this Congress, but I do anticipate that it will be taken up in the next Congress, so it will need to be reintroduced, and higher ed reauthorization is up in the next Congress, and it's anticipated that it could be a part of that. So it's unclear right now whether or not it will be a standalone bill or whether or not it will be part of the Higher Ed Reauthorization Act. And so there is opportunity to improve it. I would not say that this is a bill that is certainly getting, as I said, bipartisan support and attention, and there may be things that need to be improved, but I do think it is important for its passage. And I think it is important to send a message to our students, to our faculty, to our administrators, to law enforcement, to our communities, and to our parents, that this is something that not only will not be tolerated, but that higher ed institutions, and I know you take this so very seriously, but it is to try to provide, I think, a bit more uniformity, to provide a bit more structure to how it's handled. It is also, I think, to provide just that reassurance to the victims of these crimes that their allegations will be treated with the respect and with all the seriousness that they are due. And that we can help the victims of sexual assault, whether they are women or men, heal in the long term, for the long term, so that they can become productive members of society. So with that, look forward to hearing from you. I know we have a diverse group. I want to thank everybody for coming this morning and sharing with us. And we have a diverse group of schools. And I'm going to turn it back over to Teresa to get us started. I'm going to grab my water.
Well, I can tell, I usually read a crowd pretty well, the body language, and I can tell that you're anxious and you're itching to talk about this because you work on this so much every day, and many of you feel, not sure the word is proud of your efforts, but you feel that your efforts are deserving of being noticed and recognized today, even though you may have some very specific words of counsel of how we could look at this legislation as it goes forward. Do the Senate and the House bill look exactly the same?
Yes.
Okay. So we know that, whenever you have a bipartisan piece of legislation, especially as polarized as Washington, D.C. is right now, you know that that means that there's a lot of interest in that. I have been incredibly impressed with the discussions that I've had with members of our colleges and universities who have come and met with me, who came at a meeting we had at the commission, and then I've had follow-up meetings with several of you as well. And so I don't for one moment doubt the seriousness with which you take this issue. And that you feel that, and that you have been talking about this issue for a long time. So the question is, one could always argue that in any kind of a situation like this, some do things very, very well, and then perhaps some have not been able to operate at the same level. So I think that may be part of what the Congressman was talking about when we talk about a standard level of expectation for students no matter where they go to school. That when families send their children to school as young adults, or when independent young adults, or older adults for that matter, choose to be involved in the higher education community, that in fact they can spend their time working on the things we want them to do, which is to be academically prepared for jobs in the future. And so this was true in K-12. Those of us who have worked in K-12 know this as well. It's pretty hard to talk about accountability until families believe people are safe when they go to school. So with that sense of knowing that we are really all in this together, I'd like us to really now turn to a discussion with you, and I'll try to sort of moderate this, but we are both mics, so I'll step aside and you can stand up and respond, and you can actually ask questions directly to the Congresswoman. But I know that you know what these questions are, and that some of you feel very you feel compelled to really share some of the good work that you're doing. We want you to do that. But I'm going to start with a question that doesn't allow you to go immediately to that, because I know what we'll all do is we'll all talk about how great all the great work is at our institutions, and we want to hear that. But first, I'd like to start with a question that we pose to you, which is what exists in current federal and or state policy, but I think we're probably going to talk more about federal policy because there is more policy that actually dictates behaviors around sexual assault on campuses than a state. But what exists in current federal policy that prevents universities from better addressing the issue of on-campus violence? So is there something that the feds are not actually considering at the level they do, or that may conflict with what you're doing, or that policy doesn't recognize what you're doing? I know, and if I don't get any answers, I'll call out a school in particular that I know shared some information in this regard. But before I do that, I'll give you a chance to actually answer anything about federal policies that get in your way.
Sure.
Yeah, yes, and we do have
How
more.
are you going to do it?
Bring the mic around.
Okay.
Bring the mic around. It'll just be easier.
Hi, I'm Katie from Ball State. And as I thought about this question, it was not so much, I termed it not what exists in the federal policies, but more maybe what is lacking in those or what could be used to enhance them. And for me, as a practitioner, it would be standardization of some terminology so that complainants, regardless of where they are, and alleged offenders, regardless of where they are nationally, would know that we're operating from a common set of language around consent and around things like incapacitation and defining some of this, not necessarily always in the same or the common framework of female complainant and male offender, but same sex. And so what non-consensual touching or non-consensual other kinds of behaviors could be defined.
So let me ask you before you respond, are you looking for federal definitions of those terms? And also from now, when you stand up, would you not only tell us your name, but tell us what you do on the campus where you serve as well? I think that would be helpful. So are you actually looking for standardized terms for things like consent or incapacitation?
Yes. I think that helps because and I work with Title IX investigations on our campus. And so as I'm considering people's statements and listening carefully through the interviews, these very often come to a question of consent. And so even though other states have attempted to use that people would actually ask and answer, that could oversimplify. And so it won't be easy work, but all of the language that could be used to define consent and other behaviors besides spoken word that could give consent.
And do you feel that the state law is clearer on that than the federal law?
No.
Okay, so we've got challenges with both state and federal law.
We probably don't have any state law that actually deals with consent. And actually, as you know, when you look at the higher ed articles that are being written about this whole discussion of consent has taken on a life of its own. And there are some states, I don't know, maybe some of you know how many states have actually defined consent, because you're right, some states have, we haven't. Anybody have any idea how many states have actually walked down that road? Anybody think differently about standardized definitions of terms? Because at the end of the day, if the Congresswoman knows when we leave that everybody thinks there should be standardized definition of terms, that might help.
And I guess I would ask terms, you hit on hot ones, I mean, with respect to consent and so forth, but would you also like standardized when it has to do with the process? What type of terms? So, and you're saying no. So process.
This is, you know, once again, I'm seeing heads going like this, and I'm seeing heads going not like that, which is exactly what we want to have happen today, because it will be from the richness of this discussion that we'll figure out where we are. So,
Assault is not really defined clearly. I mean, that's the most fundamental definition, I would say.
do individual campuses have their own definitions of assault?
I'll speak to that. My name is Connie Adams. I'm with St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. I oversee our program which addresses sexual violence, dating violence, and stalking on campus. And ideally, I think that would be a great idea. In terms of a federal level, I'm also concerned thinking about how different states define sexual violence. With some states, alcohol cannot be a fact. If alcohol is involved, consent cannot be given. But for most states, that's not the case. So I think in terms of looking at things at a federal level, it could become really challenging to have that language and have that be consistent because state laws related to these issues vary so greatly. But yes, most campuses now do and are moving to the mandated kind of area of having to define these issues. So I think it needs to be very clear, but I can appreciate the challenges that come up with those cases, but I'm not sure that having the same standard is necessarily possible at a federal level.
Representative Hale?
Thank you. I think it's also important to point out that there is no standard definition of rape state by state. So often when we're talking about national statistics, we're using the Centers for Disease Control definition for rape, which is sexual activity that is unwanted by anyone. And as far as states and their definition, I think we should also keep in mind the landmark bill that just was signed by the governor in California regarding affirmative consent and defining consent as something that has to be affirmed and it can't be given, if somebody is incapacitated or in any way. But it's something certainly we're considering here. I know I'm considering filing a bill this coming year to take a look at that. And finally, in case people are not aware, the definition for rape in Indiana just changed on July 1 of this year, including the recommended sentencing guidelines for that crime, or those crimes, more accurately.
I'm Angela Batista. I'm with the students at the University of Southern Indiana. I think the other piece that was mentioned that is important to think about is around same-sex definitions because it varies depending on where we are demographically in the country, I think. But if we're talking at definitions at the federal level, that's going to be really important. It's really problematic. We're seeing more and more cases, not only of sexual assault, but stalking and all the definitions, dating violence, that are really hard to, from a discipline point of view, be consistent on when you look at the definitions and the policies that we're functioning from. So it's going to be important to broaden those definitions to be inclusive of the issues that students are actually bringing to our campuses. I think that's going to be crucial.
I'd like to call out IU if I could, because they shared with us a document that actually has some ideas regarding federal legislation gaps, and this might be a good opportunity for you to share as well, just because I have it in front of me here, so I know there are some thoughts. Specifically, this is about ideas that you would like Congress, represented by Susan, to keep in mind.
Right, and I apologize because I don't remember exactly what we put in our document. I'm Emily Springston, involved with the student welfare compliance effort at IU. I agree with everything that's been put forward in terms of the challenges of the definitions. On the definition of consent, I think the interesting piece is in California, it's only as to higher ed. And that's an interesting question too, is are we also still thinking in a bubble versus what's outside? So when we're talking about criminal definitions versus what definition may be in our institutions, which are different. I'm not sure what the...
I know I have in front of you, which is a little bit unfair, but the things that have been shared with me was one, that Congress should produce comprehensive legislation that streamlines current federal law and clarifies compliance requirements and expectations. Another was that Congress should develop a uniform code of reporting or national incident-based reporting system, as others responded to, please let me know. And third is that, and I thought this was an interesting one, and I think you will as well, that Congress should explicitly direct the Department of Justice to act as the lead federal agency rather than the Department of Education, and the Department of Education should defer to DOJ. So with that, any response to any of those suggestions? They're pretty specific.
Well, I'm I'll respond to the last point. I'm Jim Clark. I'm Assistant General Counsel for Architect and Title IX Coordinator. And I've dealt with DOE a lot, and one of my biggest concerns is this notion of due process and the risks that are created for colleges when they're dictating the standard of proof in disciplinary proceedings. And as you mentioned, if this act does allow DOE to retain a percentage of fines they collect, my concern is that eventually colleges are going to be put in a no-win position. If we don't prosecute, for lack of a better word, accuse, or if we do it at a standard that does not meet Department of Ed's current preponderance of the evidence proposal, there's going to be a lot of exposure for colleges, and I would feel more comfortable, I think, with Department of Justice, an entity with more experience, and I'm assuming those are similar to IU's concerns, but that's my 2 cents worth.
I don't want to oversimplify this if you don't feel comfortable indicating, I would appreciate that, but would you, how many in the room would actually believe that statement is correct, that the Congress should explicitly direct the Department of Justice to act as the lead federal agency? By show of hands, schools?
Who agree that DOJ should be lead, not education?
And I'm not necessarily inferring that the rest of you think it should not be, and maybe that you just don't have a strong feeling about it. So,
are there any that actually think, because I was kind of like you, are there any that believe DOE should be the lead, and if you could explain why?
I'm planning on talking, but I guess I just walked into that one. Simply for the fact that, I'm sorry, not at the Aris University of St. Francis, I'm the Title IX coordinator as well as the Dean of Students. Although I will grant that I don't feel comfortable with the potential for DOE or OCR to be incentivized in the manner that they could be by receiving some financial benefit from their investigations. We work in higher ed, and if I have to believe that one of those departments has a better understanding of the complexities, despite my misgivings of how some of the documentation has come down thus far and the advice, I would have to go with the DOE. Department of Justice is going to, I believe, approach things from a much more legalistic and criminal proceeding manner, and I don't think that that is the appropriate view. We do not have access to forensics. We are not trained police investigators, and quite frankly, what the respondent is facing does not measure up to life and liberty in terms of what they have at stake. Therefore, I totally agree that preponderance is the correct finding to use, but as a result, I don't believe that Department of Justice is well suited and well informed of the complexities that are present when one is engaging in the conduct process on an institution of higher education. Could be totally wrong, and sometimes I hope I am, but that would just be my first sense. DOE has an experience and has a background in having that kind of understanding. I don't know what the baseline for DOJ would be and what their expectations would be in terms of managing or oversight of our processes.
John.
John Applegate, Indiana University, Executive Vice President, and Technology and Competence at IU. The points that were just made, I think, are really important ones. But I think what we're seeing here is a full-scale adoption of a criminal kind of process for universities. And so if the universities are being put in the position, I think mistakenly, of acting like prosecutors or being expected to respond in a criminal justice kind of way, then our view is that's why we need the Department of Justice instead of the Department of Education. That is, if we're going to go down that road, which I think is an unfortunate road to go down for the universities, then we need to have people who have expertise in that area, hence our recommendation. I think in general, it's absolutely right that what universities can do is deal with the limited issue of the relationship of students with the university. And I think that often gets confused with being a criminal justice organization like a court or like a prosecutor. I mean, we at IU work very closely with our local law enforcement, with the local prosecutors, with the local courts to make sure that there is not a gap between us and that people are not falling between the cracks. Students, especially victims, are aware of their rights and the opportunities to seek redress in that way. But the gist of so much of this is making universities little courts, and we don't have authorities to do it. We shouldn't have authorities to be little criminal justice systems. So I think that's the reason that many of us think that having the Department of Justice is more appropriate.
Yes. Hi, I'm Kathy Keith. I'm from Martin University. I am their Director of Legal Compliance at the university and the Title IX officer. I tend to agree with IU in some respects that we do need to have some type of uniform that should be overlooked by the Department of Justice. I think that the Department of Education should have some input as well as a result of this, because we were talking about college students and college regulations and things that we have to abide by as a result of that. But nonetheless, there's a lot of things that we have to consider. We have to consider the victims, but we have to consider the accused as well. You have a vast amount of issues that you're considering when you're talking about having a preponderance of the evidence standard for a person where universities have to enter into MOUs with the local law enforcement agencies. Entering in these MOUs with the local law enforcement agencies causes, on one hand, a person who could be wrongfully accused or someone who's accused of themselves. There are due process issues at this point. You are talking about a person, and when you're entering in the MOU, for sharing this type of information, whereas this person who voluntarily gives an information or gives statements to the university that could very well be used against them in a criminal investigation. Oftentimes, most of our universities don't allow lawyers or counsels to come in during these investigations. They're not apprised the opportunity to have people there to represent them. So things that they're saying at these investigations could very well be used against these children in a court of law, and which has a high penalty assessed with them, being reported as a sex offender if they're found guilty for some things that they may or may not have said, and you could be sending children, and I will say children, because a majority of the kids that are in institute have no idea what's going on. They're totally uninformed. To penal institutions as a result of some of the things that they said at these hearings where they were not advised or didn't have counsel. I think that we really have to have some clear standards put in place here so that we can make sure that not only are the victims protected, but the accusers are protected. And that's why it is very crucial that we do work with the Department of Justice. Well, this has been, obviously I think this has started to expose the complexity of the issues that we're asking you and you to deal with. I did hear sort of in response to both the last two speakers and what I understand that IU had written was that, DOJ has has its own crime definitions. So at that point, how do you juxtapose those with the way that colleges and universities operate when it's not a criminal justice system? And what does that mean for people who then become a part of both of the process at both levels? So with that, I'll turn to Purdue.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I'm Alicia Christmas Rawlett, and I'm the Vice President for Ethics and Compliance, and I'm also the Title IX Coordinator. I think we generally agree with the comments that IU shared with you. But I'd like to sort of perhaps turn it slightly, which is the remembering that we are colleges and universities, and we are not the criminal justice system. And I don't think that a college or university ought to be a criminal justice system. And so the overlap with the bill and some of the provisions in the bill have implications because we are universities situated in states that have state laws that need to be enforced as well. And so, I don't think that universities ought to be, as in California it appears, that there's a special law when you're in a university as opposed to being a citizen of the state of California, whether you're in college or not in college. And we certainly feel that the health, safety, and welfare of our students is important. But to give you a concrete example, so the CASA bill, you focus on confidential resources and designating of those confidential resources. And we certainly have designated confidential resources on the campus, but we are mindful that those confidential resources need to actually be confidential resources. That is to say, recognized by the state as being confidential resources. We already have cases that are now running through the court systems where a campus has designated someone a confidential resource, but the courts don't recognize them as a confidential resource. So it's critically important that while we believe that people ought to be able to have confidential resources, that it's not just well, while you're on the campus, the person is confidential, but then if you find yourself in litigation, the person was not actually confidential. And so those nuances are really hard for traditional aged students to understand. We think that there ought to be flexibility within universities. We're not all one size fits all. And I think if we can focus on the big picture, training, resources, those types of things, we feel that we ought to be able to hold our students accountable as members of our community. So when they violate the community norms, our most drastic remedy is to remove them from our communities. We're not able to put them in jail, we're not able to fine them, we don't have those sorts of resources. So to the extent that the federal government can assist us in developing standardized trainings, resources, that would seem to be a better approach than trying to develop a one-size-fits-all where the states don't have a one-size-fits-all. We talked about consent, we talked about definitions of it. It varies state by state. We believe in sort of the experimentalization among states. We think within our institutions, we'd like to have the flexibility to hold our people accountable. And we'd like to as well have resources and to be able to share those resources.
I have a question. I certainly appreciate that the higher ed institutions do not want to be criminal justice institutions and should not be criminal justice institutions, and that for the victim that is willing to go forward in the criminal justice system, that I think that is the big issue here. For the victim that's willing to go forward in the criminal justice system, then the criminal justice system kind of comes in and takes it over, right? But I think, and in coordination with you all, our bigger challenge is those so many victims that choose not to go forward in the criminal justice system. And I know they're out there, because I know a young woman who is one of those victims. And so what does then the higher ed institution do in that role? Because, and you know, for those of us who've not experienced that victimization, it's impossible to know why they don't go forward until, you know, you've dealt with them and as victim advocates, and they do know why people don't go forward. But then what is the role of the institution? I think that's actually the harder, because law enforcement, do any of you have an issue that law enforcement is resistant to getting involved on your campuses? once you have victims that want to proceed? Does anyone have that situation? I mean, we need to know that as elected officials because most law enforcement are willing to come in and with their victim advocates and with their resources, prosecutor's office, sheriff's, or police departments, and take it over. Our bigger challenge, I think, is this other one, where victims won't agree to go into the criminal justice system. Am I wrong? Or
I don't want to monopolize things, but for very good reasons, victims don't want to go forward through the criminal justice system because it's not a very victim-centered approach, and particularly in issues of sexual assault. And we simply have prosecutors who will not bring the cases, particularly if there's alcohol involved. And we know from studies that have been done that anywhere from people have estimated 50 to 90% of these matters involve alcohol consumption by someone. And to the extent that we have local prosecutors who say, alcohol involved, not going to get it beyond a reasonable doubt, I'm not going to bring it forward. And victims know this, they've shared that they're not going to bring these cases, and they don't bring the cases. We are happy to, in these unfortunate circumstances, to hold people accountable under our policies, but we're holding them accountable under the university's policies, not the criminal justice statutes. So people will never be happy if what they want from a university is for criminal prosecution. That, and we would urge you to call the local prosecutors and hold them accountable for bringing forward these cases, because these students do not give up their rights as citizens by coming to a college campus. And to have prosecutors say, as they have said in our jurisdiction, well, you all can handle it better. Well, we can't put anybody in jail.
My name is Rachel Brady, and I'm a senior at Louisville University. I'm very involved on campus with combating these issues from a student perspective, and I just really want to touch on the difference between campus and criminal system, and definitely students do not feel comfortable coming forward with the criminal system compared to the campus system. And one of the biggest reasons from the survivors that I've talked to is that it's so much harder for survivors to go through the criminal system. And there's so much more potential for it to be public and to be re-traumatizing. The campus system is typically more tailored to students and more understanding, especially at IU. I know that our system has gone through a lot of transformation to helping survivors feel more comfortable going through this process. And so that's one reason students feel that these are completely different situations and they're much less willing to go through the criminal justice system. But I think many students understand, and I hope that more and more are coming to understand, that there is a difference between this standard of evidence, and I think that students recognize that that difference is important because the university is a privilege for students to be on campus, and if they violate that privilege by being violent to another student, then they no longer deserve to be on that campus, which is why the standard of evidence is lower, because they're not going to jail if they get kicked off campus. They're just, it's like the conduct boards for high schools. If you misbehave in high school, you get suspended. If you misbehave in college, you get suspended. We're not sending students to jail. So I think that students understand that it's a different standard of evidence because it's completely different stakes. And that's another reason why students feel comfortable going to the campus system versus the criminal system.
thank you.
But for those students who do choose to go to the criminal justice system, should we be able to, I'm looking for things that we can read today that we might have, find a few things that we could do. Back to your comment, is there some way for us to provide some protection in this legislation for the confidential advisors who are selected at the campus level so that they're not, what I heard you saying is, it's unique to the campus, and when they're then asked to go into the criminal justice system, it creates a conflicting message to be a confidential advisor. So I'm not sure whether this is true or not, but would there be some consensus that confidential advisors at the campus level should be protected as confidential advisors? I think no, I see only positive responses to that. Yes?
In the state of Indiana, victim advocates do have privilege. So they do have privilege.
And so just ensuring that that is afforded the confidential advisor status at the federal level is what we're hearing.
Yeah, come in.
Hi, I'm Paula Granger from Belrose University. I'm the assistant director of our sexual assault office. And one of the things in the 19 years I've worked with victims, it's very heart-wrenching to be there when there's been a judicial board process in which they have found that the alleged perpetrator was in fact not held to that, to the preponderance of the evidence. And so for them, it was a win-lose. And if you want to talk about re-traumatized, I will tell you that I watched them be re-traumatized and then felt like they were treated as if they were a liar. And I think that when you're looking at then going towards a mini court, students who sit on judicial board will tell you they take a big deep breath before they're going to want to find somebody guilty, because if they do, then that person is going to be suspended. So if that's a difficult thing for students in terms of who would sit on the judicial board, it's going to be a lot more difficult when you're looking at more criminal activity. And then just along with that, when we're talking about mini course, I think that is the issue. And I'm just wondering, why are we helping going down that road when many universities agree that that is probably the wrong way to go? Because I think the last thing, and sorry, but I think that when there is a case that comes before us, we're going to say, yeah, go to judicial board, and once it becomes like a mini court, because otherwise we will be accused of sweeping things under the rug, no matter what the level. And I can tell you, in terms of working with the alleged perpetrators as well, there's a spectrum. There is an absolute spectrum of different types of sexual violence, and we're not identifying the problem.
I think that's been a great discussion. We have several other items we'd like to consider, so I'm going to move to the second question, which actually deals, I think, in a positive way with what's happening on your colleges and universities, either in terms of online or in-person educational programming and training that's being conducted for students. So when they, generally speaking, I think this happens when they begin as a new student on your campus, but it may be ongoing as well. And what your measures are and how effective your programs are for students. And, and then the next question really has to do with how you're actually, at some point looking at your faculty and staff and training for them too. So I think this could actually consider both of those discussions in the same as you answer the question. So first, what are you doing with your new or your current students to make sure that they know all they need to know on this issue, and then how are you training the faculty and staff? Now, I have 21 campuses. We have 21 campuses represented here today, so I know that there are 21 of you who would like to tell us what you're doing, so we won't have time to do that. So one, try to be really concise, and as much as possible, try to share things that you think might be beneficial to other campuses as well that you're doing.
Hi, at IU, I'm going to pass it real quick to Rachel because she speaks about this so well, but there's not a lot of research on the effectiveness of different programming, but we do know that the bystander-based intervention training is the more effective. And the goal is how you reach as many as you can, but I was going to let Rachel kind of describe what we're doing.
So this would be back to what you were saying, talking about from the
culture from the kids, from the students up.
It's actually funny that you say that, because I'm actually one of the student leaders of a group on campus called Culture of Care, and we have 4 focus areas, one of which is sexual well-being. And we focus on raising awareness of these issues, educating students about resources, and encouraging Hoosiers to have the courage to intervene when someone's in trouble. So one of our programs is the Step Up Bystander Intervention Program, and this topic of bystander intervention has become more and more popular and more recognized as a really meaningful way to encourage students to intervene in dangerous situations. And currently, Step Up at IU has trained more than 2,000 students in this bystander intervention program, and this is in the past 2 years. So we have been very busy on this, and the goal of Culture of Care that we are student-led and staff-supported. We're a small group of about 11 students, And we try to contact students on the ground, face to face, talking about these issues and making sure students understand that like they can come forward. How do we talk about this? And how do we transform our culture? And so bystander intervention is a really key part of that. Other things that IU does, other than Step Up, is at orientation. We have quite a few programs that educate freshmen about the importance of intervention. And we go through specific scenarios talking about how do you get through this situation if you see this happen. And we found that to be really important and helpful for freshmen in particular because they're coming to campus wild-eyed, not knowing how to handle these kinds of things. So walking them through scenarios makes it really real for them. So.
And is this, and I mentioned it in the remarks, Senator Merritt's, State Senator Merritt's Lifeline Law, which has been around for some time, did sexual assault specifically, is that specifically in his bill as well? And so the culture of care involves kind of a whole spectrum, whether drug overdose, alcohol, sexual, okay. And is that something that you all are feeling that students really understand, know about, and how are we educating them on the Lifeline Law that extends beyond sexual assault?
Janelle Chikarian from St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, Assistant Vice President. I think to piggyback off the Lifeline Law, one thing that's been successful for us is to also have a Good Samaritan and a medical amnesty policy specifically on our campus, especially because we are a private institution, and really reinforcing that caring for one another. And extending that beyond alcohol into reporting of all crimes, especially ones of violence. So that's something that we can do as individual institutions to support our students. And to go along with the bystander training, we do Green Dot training on our campus that is extremely successful.
So how many of your campuses require something for incoming freshmen in the area of safety, sexual assault as part of your orientation? It would appear that nearly all of you do. So then in your responses, could you talk to us a little bit about how you measure the effectiveness of what you're doing?
Connie Adams with St. Mary's College. In terms of measuring the effectiveness, we do several different programming pieces that have kind of changed and worked to kind of tailor those needs. I think online programming, depending on the size of the institution, is a great way in terms of accessing a large number of students and can have built-in measurement. But at the same time, we've had questions related to, and I think this can be to any type of mandatory programming, you may be reaching a large number, is that large number retaining the information, are you engaging with them? So sometimes you can, reach a large number and check out the box in terms of they have X knowledge, but is it really having a large scale impact that we want to be having? And so I think while there's a lot of benefits in terms of looking at mandatory programming, I think there's also a lot of drawbacks and concerns related to that engagement piece and how students may choose or choose not to move forward with addressing these issues kind of beyond that time. I think the bystander intervention is a really key piece. I'm so glad that that's been brought up on a couple of occasions because that is where the most promising research is leading us. I think it meets really well with how students tend to be developmentally, maybe not identifying something bad could happen to me, but something bad could happen to other people, and so it engages them in a way that other types of programs may not do. One last comment that I wanted to make related to kind of the culture change piece is that I think it needs to come from students, but on the flip side of that, if institutions are embracing that this is work that needs to be done and there are administrators that are supporting that, or whether federally that's required, that is how it happens. That we can't necessarily just assume students are going to be taking this on their own and making that change. But if we are requiring these types of pieces where bystander intervention is a significant piece of culture change, then when we implement those programs, it's engaging in the right way to widen the impact.
Other thoughts about programs that you're offering?
Thank you. Kay Bales, Ball State Vice President for Student Affairs. Obviously, I think all of us in this room have been doing this education for a very long time, but perhaps the way that we're doing it may be changing a little bit. We offer about 15 programs per month on our campus. We have peer advocates out there. We have people in residence life, in our university police department, and various other departments and student affairs, making sure that we can target and reach as many students as possible. But I do think really key to all of that is peer-on-peer education. People don't necessarily want to hear from a 50-year-old woman talk about what's going on in the student culture, but they certainly can relate with their peers. For our mandatory program for new students and as well for new faculty and staff, we are doing an online program. It is a commercial product that we were able to customize to fit some of our own campus needs, as well as have the opportunity to educate students about the Lifeline law in Indiana, what our own policies are and procedures. There's still room to research and needed research on the efficacy of these kinds of programs, but one of the things that we were able to do is to really gain a lot of analytics out of what types of information did students not know when they went through this program, and then how much time on task did they spend learning what they didn't know. And then there's some follow-up that we can do to see what the information retention is for students. So I still think that there's, we still need to determine really the long-term efficacy of this particular approach, but at least initially, we think it shows some promise. And then, of course, as a number of people have said, bystander education is really, I think, showing the most promise, and I would concur with those statements.
Is there anyone that does something really focused for upperclassmen rather than freshmen?
The
and
program that Rachel was describing is focused on upperclassmen as well.
Any other thoughts on this?
Chris Gibson, Associate Vice President of Student Services at Indiana Tech, and also Title IX Coordinator. The one question that I have, or comment I want to make, is it seems like for some of us, our hands are being a little bit forced with one option. For those universities who have some enrollment that is online only, we're limited to an online only option. We have, at our university, we have day students, we have evening adult students, we have online students. We have a wide variety. And if we're to hit every student by the word of the legislation, we have to use an online option. So.
Thank you for making that distinction and making sure that we recognize the online education separately. Thank you.
Let's turn to discussion about the requirement that there be campus climate surveys, which I know some of your campuses are already doing it, but all of you are not. And I guess I would ask you what value you see in those, what kinds of results you're seeing. Should they be required? And have your surveys resulted in any new information that's caused you to change your policies? And then as a part of this, this is a big sort of, I'll throw all these questions out there. This is a little bit separate from the other questions about, but it does fit in with climate. Do you have concern, or have your surveys indicated that there is a development of a, for want of a better way to say it, a party culture at campuses that may be contributing to difficulty in handling this issue? So campus climate surveys, what you're finding out the campus climate is it changed any of your policies, and what about the overall environment on the campuses that play into the safety of your students?
Thank you. All State. We will be implementing our campus climate survey at the end of this week. Actually, it goes out. But prior to that, we have participated in the American College Health Assessment, and as part of that assessment, there are a number of questions related to campus sexual assault, or sexual violence in general, and then also a lot of questions about behaviors related to alcohol and drug culture. And so the nice thing about that particular instrument is that it is then nationally normed, and you can compare your responses to that of other institutions. So we were able, we've been doing this for 20 years or more, and so we are able to use that information to guide us in deciding where we need to spend our resources on education and intervention strategies. So it's very helpful. The campus climate survey that would be required by the Department of Education, I think a number of us share concerns about, and Congresswoman Brooks, you mentioned, how that really gets implemented, and then how's that what can people really glean from those responses? And I think that's probably something that gives us all pause, is then how is that information used? All of our schools are required to provide query statistics. We do that willingly, want to be very transparent. But as we anticipated, most of us will probably see an increase in the number of sexual assaults reported on our campus by all of the attention and strategies that we put in place. And that's what we want to have happen. We want people to come forward. But without that context of knowing why those numbers may be increasing, it's disconcerting to some of us that people just pick up a statistic and assume that they know exactly what that means.
And I'm really interested in also in the issue with mandatory surveys and annual and the manner in which they will be conducted. Yes.
Hey, Nathan, at Neon State University, I'm assistant assistant advocacy with this climate. I see value in this climate survey and that it is used as a tool to inform the education that we're providing for our students, as well as faculty and staff. So I think that faculty and staff should be included in that campus climate survey, one, because they are an element of the campus climate, and we need to be educating them. If we have that campus climate survey to inform the education that we provide to them, we can see if we need to address racial acceptance with them, as well as their knowledge of campus policies and procedures and their ability to comply with those with fidelity. So I think there's value in those surveys. But again, if we can compare across the country, that would provide some value as well. Any thoughts?
Would these surveys be, and I'm just curious, do you feel that in order to comply, it would be a separate survey specifically on this topic, or are these going to be questions that you insert in other campus climate surveys?
So the federal legislation requires.
I don't know. That's why it appears to require separate. However, it appears to require separate. However, does that make sense that it be separate, or could it be that there are a category of questions that could be included in another campus? Again, I'm trying to find the practical application here and what makes the most sense. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Connie Adams of St. Mary's College. I think that in terms of, it depends on the extent of what we're looking at and the number of questions. Some of the sample documents that are available through alone.gov are fairly extensive. And so depending on if there is something specific that's required, integrating it into other types of evaluations might be not provide the best response rates or really be sound in terms of the information that's provided depending on the length. I think that there's different categories of information to be looking at collecting. And so if we're looking at some of the prevalence rates, I think that's really critical and is implemented in some other national surveys that are really helpful that are out there now. There's additional questions related to kind of perceptions related to how the campus addresses these issues, which aren't necessarily incorporated. But the one, I really agree with what has been said already. But the one additional point that I wanted to make is that depending on the type of institution, I think there can be varying additional, objectives or questions in terms of the phrasing that can make it more tailored to different institutions. And so I would love to see something in some ways that would really be able to do a cross comparison, but when you're looking at so many drastically different types of institutions, I also have some significant concerns over what those questions could look like, and how specific they could be to really get a true understanding for each individual campus.
But it seems that we could actually figure out a way to do that in surveys to recognize admission differentiation and demographics of the institutions based on number of residential students and online, and actually draw maybe additional questions. It seems to me, and I'm here to learn, that the lack of some standardization of this actually puts the colleges and universities in a more precarious position, because some may report some way which makes them look different than someone else. So I actually think it provides some degree of protection to have some standardization of the reporting. Back here.
She said a lot of the same things that I was going to comment on about that. But I would comment that we use a core survey, which is Vincent University. We use the core survey, and there is already a mechanism in there to add about 12 extra questions. So if it was very short, then that would be a great mechanism where we could just add it to what we already have. But if we're talking about something that's very extensive, then I would think it would need to be something that was a little bit more separate. I'm wondering also about maybe, depending on the size of the university, like I know a lot of hospitals, when they do their surveys, they compare like-minded type hospitals, and I'm thinking that with universities that might be another issue to take into consideration. Of course, some standardization, but also considering, is it a 2-year versus a 4-year college, things like that.
Congresswoman Brooks made a comment in her opening remarks about the change in the culture now with online and Facebook and all the ways in which people communicate. And I know I'm going to go to that question next. So start thinking about that, but I don't want to. You probably have a comment about the last question.
A couple just. I agree with a lot of the thoughts. I think they're great thoughts. The concern with some of the way the legislation is proposed now, I think it does say annually, and it also creates a requirement that the school guarantee, I think, a certain number of students complete the survey rather than distribute it. And so I think you get into some questions about the value of the data that you're going to receive, whether it was coerced. How often so it gives me pause that will there be thought put into how this tool is created and used. I know some folks who research in this area are concerned about some of those surveys that are out, but not alone, and some of the drafting there. And then I go back to what is the purpose. If the purpose is for the institution to learn and to tweak and to change our communication, our programmings, which is why we see the tool for that purpose, that makes sense. In terms of for then information for parents and prospective people to understand and look at that as evidence of whether a school has a certain number of crimes, I worry in the same way that the Clery data is somehow slightly misleading in terms of what that really means for what's happening at your institution, within your community, those sorts of things.
Do you think some standard, back to my comment about some, at least if we're all operating on the same page, to the degree that there may be questions based on different kinds of missions of institutions, but if you have sort of a basic expectation of what is supposed to be in those questions, it seems to me that it provides some degree of protection for you to have institutions in a like manner reporting.
I like that suggestion of honing down a little bit more to comparing apples to apples, and then maybe a certain set, a limited number of questions that we're all trying to get at, but leaving discretion back to the schools for how they want to broaden that.
Let's turn to our final question, then I want to leave time for the Congresswoman to make some final comments and ask if you have anything else that you just feel she really needs to know before she leaves here today, because it didn't fit into one of our questions. And that is to go to this discussion about the changes that have taken place on campuses because of technology. We all agree that, 85% of all the changes have great benefit to students and help us in what we're doing. That is the case in most things in life. What's good can also be abused. And so have you ever seen any incidents, or are you concerned at all about the informal way in which students communicate, and that this could have a chilling effect on people, because privacy, whether this is through some sort of bullying kind of attitude about, it actually could put a chilling effect on reporting, or whether that's one issue related to this, and then the other is the very legitimate issue of how people could even be, one could argue that sexual assault needs to actually consider what happens to people with these kinds of behaviors as well, in terms of how people's lives are exposed and whether there's veracity attached to this or it's not, and all the ways in which I feel that, as hard as it is for us to talk about face-to-face and what that means when two people are involved, you think about all the different things when you expand this to the technological advances that have taken place. So that's a confusing way of saying, I'm putting something out there and hoping that some of you can make some sense of that for us. Any thoughts in that regard about technology and how people communicate and whether it's, yes?
And I'm very interested in hearing what's happened in the investigations, and I know many, if not all of your campuses have been involved in investigations at some point or the other. How has social media issues played a role in your investigations and or your adjudication?
These are all for the university. Certainly, technology plays a role, so that's one of the ways in which persons can sexually exploit one another. The photos, the Instagrams, the postings on whatever, and those are covered by our policies, and we look at those as a type of sexual harassment via those means. Certainly, students are and victim survivors are frequently concerned about their social group. And so, in terms of barriers to coming forward, what will people think? I'm friends with the accused, the respondent. We're in the same social network, and nowadays, with a click of a text message, it can go viral. And so, people are concerned about that, but earlier they would have been concerned about people talking or writing notes as opposed to sending it through social media. So I think it's just one of those. It's something that we're all aware of, and the same dangers and same concerns that people had about others knowing what's going on remain, and it's just another way in which people communicate, and it has far-reaching consequences. Whereas a photo in the old days, when it was, people thought it was a big deal to make a second copy of a photograph, much less post it. I was there. I remember. It's a drastically different world in terms of the harm that can be done.
Angela Batista, University of Southern Indiana. I won't repeat everything you said. I totally agree. I also think that it's important for us to think about. I don't think students really understand the extent to which things that are put out on social media stay with them and continue to stay with them as they move on to careers and having different stages in their lives. And so I think that not only are other students sort of jumping on the bandwagon, for lack of a better language, when they hear things are happening, and it becomes an issue when you're running an investigation to really protect the process and the victim and the accused, while also addressing concerns. People are triggered if they've experienced things in the past and feel very strongly. It's a very emotional issue, and it can be really complicated. And particularly, I think, for traditional students, traditionally aged students, social media they've grown up expressing themselves in this way. So they talk about anything that they feel. So they don't really see that filter when it's happening. And so that need for education is really key. But I think any legislation that includes something about social media should really emphasize education for students on, we talk to our students, for example, in career development about whatever you put out there, they will do searches when you apply for jobs, and it's similar. These things are there. What about due process? If somebody is accused and then is found not responsible, or you find evidence that it wasn't true, what does that do? Because once out there, it's out there, maybe forever. And so kind of really helping everyone involved understand, both as a victim and any other role in the process, that they're going to have long-term reaching effects. And if we go back to the point about the outside world and the criminal world, we find out things from social media, so does law enforcement. So what does that mean? If somebody's just writing something, does that now put the victim at risk or the accused in that way as well?
We are closing in on our time. Is there, I'm going to make a couple closing comments, and I'm going to let the last word go to the Congresswoman in just a second. So I was just going to say, is there anything else that anyone would like to say as we close? Representative Hale, and then I'll take a comment here. And then anything else has to be really important.
Thank you. I'll be brief, Commissioner. I'd also like everyone to know that right now there's a study active in the field regarding the children of Indiana and sexual assault, and these children will soon become your students. It has to do with reporting, barriers to reporting, and ultimately prevention. If any of you would like more information about that, please track me down. I'd love to talk to you about it. One particular element to be aware of also is we are going to be looking at the role of social media and new technology in the role of these crimes, because for many reasons that we've just discussed, not only are these becoming ways that crimes can become committed, we have people using video, real live time to commit certain crimes. It's also a way to escalate and blackmail. And you sent me that selfie of you of yourself topless. Well, if you don't sleep with me, then guess what? That's going viral. There are a lot of crimes that we haven't even begun to anticipate or account for in the law. We will have more information about that for, as I said, 0 to 18 in short order, and you'll be hearing more about that in the coming year. Secondly, if any of you, just as a personal favor, we're also working on the issue of statute of limitations for rape in our state. Today, it's 5 years. You might have read some of the work being done by victim, now advocate Jenny Wendt, who experienced an assault that was from an instructor on a campus. And that person walked into the police station 5 years and a couple of days after the rape and said, she never reported it, but I'm the guy I raped her. And he was doing this really for his own kind of nefarious psychological weird purposes that I can't really speak to, other than it created an advocate out of a victim and a survivor out of a victim, and it's something that is coming, and it will probably impact what you have going on campus as well. So if that goes from 5 years to 10 years to 15 years, we're drafting that language now, but any input or thoughts you have on that would be most welcome. And I just want to thank you both for being advocate, women leaders on this issue. It's so important what you're doing. Commissioner, Congresswoman, that you convened this and are spending this time doing it is very significant, and you're certainly heroes of mine. Thank you.
Last comment.
As we share the work together and certainly watch you folks, I would just remind you that our students are of all ages, and institutional types do play a major component. The age of our students is another component that crosses the mission and the institutional types. And as we're looking at this issue, we need to realize that we've got 80-plus-year-old students as well as the 40-year-olds, and it's not just the issue of the traditional age student. It is no longer the traditional age now, as higher education is becoming older. And so just factor that in, if you would, in addition to all the other challenging issues you have.
Thank you. In closing, I'd like to thank Ivy Tech for allowing us, many thanks for letting us be here today to use the facility, and thank all of you for attending, and I'll turn it over to Congresswoman Brooks.
I just really want to thank Commissioner for convening all of you, and I have been so impressed and so pleased by her leadership, going from the state senate and all of the wonderful things she did there. I thought it was really somewhat sad when she left the senate, but then when I saw where she went, where I know her true passionate, and to see all the wonderful things that she has been doing, and just to convene this large a group on a topic that we know is so critically important in all the things that you've done. I just want to thank you, Teresa, and also want to thank you for your leadership, Representative Hale, in the State House. As a fairly new member of the State House, so am I. We're called freshmen. When you are a new member, I don't know if you're called freshman in the State House, a freshman as well, but you certainly created quite the attention on issues that I think traditionally have not gotten the attention they deserve. So I just want to thank you for that. I want to thank everybody for coming this morning. It was very instructive, but I want you to know this is really, not the end of this dialogue, because I've certainly learned in Congress it takes a while to get things done. But sometimes things can happen actually faster than we anticipated. So I would ask, and I certainly saw Megan Savage, my legislative director, scribbling feverishly to capture all the great comments and thoughts that you might have. And so I'm going to ask you to have a little homework assignment here. And please do write to us with your comments and thoughts. Some of your institutions already have done that, and I want to thank those of you that have already done that. But some of you have not had that opportunity. I am going to continue to be very engaged in this topic. We're very fortunate in that Indiana has 4 members of Congress in the 113th Congress that serve on education and workforce. Larry Bouchon, Todd Rokita, Luke Messer, and myself. And we actually have more on education and workforce than any other state. And I think that is an opportunity for us to lead. And so while I'm the one visiting with all of you, I will absolutely share your comments with my colleagues, and not just those who serve, because I will share it with all of the members of the Indiana delegation. I'll commit to you that Megan Savage, so I'm going to give you her email. Okay, and she has her card, but it's megan.savage@mail.house.gov, and then she does have cards, and we'd love for you to please share with us, because truly we were only able to touch on a few, but I think some of the critical things. I want to thank the Commissioner for starting the discussion, but we know that there are ways that this bill can be improved. I believe there will be passage of some part of this bill in the higher ed reauthorization, or possibly in a standalone bill. This is an issue that is not going away. It is a very complex issue, as you all have pointed out. I want to thank everybody for reminding us. I mean, not only is it a complex issue, it's a complex student population on our higher education institutions, and but there's probably not a circumstance that can affect an individual as much maybe as sexual assault. Whether it happens in our neighborhoods, whether it happens at a workplace, or whether it happens at a higher ed institution. And so it really affects that individual and their families for the rest of their lives. And so it's so critical that we work harder on this, that we continue to stay at this. But I think I want to thank Rachel for her insight as a student that's been very engaged. And so when you have those student leaders on your campus who really care about this, please engage them, please listen to them. We, many of us who didn't grow up with all the social media, I remember this photograph being copied also, and know what that was like. But, it is such a different world now. You all see it more than the rest of the population, because you are interacting with technology advancements faster and more than most. But we need to reward those student leaders and those students of all ages who choose to dive into this very sensitive, very difficult, but very important subject. So just want to thank everybody for being here today. We look forward to working with you and making this the best bill it can be. Thank you.